Drop the name of your city in the comments below, and stay with me all the way to the end. The first thing Laurel Voss noticed about the Brandt ranch was that it smelled like rain that had already left. Not the rain itself, not the good green, living smell of it, but the aftermath. Dry earth that had been wet once and forgotten what that felt like. She stood at the edge of the property with her one bag and her wool coat and the letter from the employment agency folded in her breast pocket, and she thought, "This place has been waiting a long time for something it doesn't know how to ask for." She was 26 years old. She had spent the last 4 years keeping house for an elderly professor in Fredericton who had died in February quietly, in his chair by the window, with his newspaper still open on his lap. He had left her 3 months' wages and a note that said, "You were the best company I ever had, and I never told you." She had folded that note and kept it. She didn't know why, exactly. Something about the waste of it. The agency had sent her west. Not far west, still Saskatchewan, still flat country, still the kind of sky that pressed down on you like a hand, but far enough that she didn't know anyone and no one knew her. The posting had been simple: housekeeper needed, ranch property outside Moose Jaw, meals provided, private room, references required. Owner, Mr. Douglas Brandt. She had not expected the silence, not the quiet of an empty house, that she knew. This was something different, the kind of silence that meant a person had been alone so long they'd stopped noticing it. Douglas Brandt met her at the door and shook her hand the way you'd shake the hand of a banker. Firm, brief. His eyes went to her bag, then to her face, then to a point somewhere past her left shoulder. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she thought, though she later revised that downward when she learned that weathered and tired were not the same as old. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and hands that had done real work for a long time. He was not unkind, he was simply not present. Like a lamp with the wick turned down so low you kept forgetting there was a flame at all. "Kitchen's through there," he said. "Room's up the stairs on the left. Breakfast at 6, supper at 7, I eat alone." He said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather. She said, "All right." He looked at her then, a quick look, like a check, and went back outside. His hired hand, a cheerful man named Percy Ford, who was missing the tip of his left ring finger from a fence post incident in 1987 and had never stopped bringing it up, met her in the kitchen 15 minutes later and explained the real situation over a cup of tea. "Doug's been running this place alone since Margaret left," Percy said, wrapping both hands around his mug. 3 years now. Before that he had a housekeeper, old woman from town, name of Mrs. Gould, but she retired and after that he just sort of stopped trying. Agency sent 2 women before you. First one left after a week. Second one lasted 3 days. He sipped his tea. "He's not mean," Percy added carefully. "He's just," he looked at the ceiling, "gone somewhere a bit, you know?" Laurel knew. She had grown up in a house like that. Her father had been gone somewhere, a bit, for most of her childhood, not absent in body, but absent in the way that mattered. You learned, in houses like that, not to make noise. You learned to be useful without asking for acknowledgement. You learned that some people had built walls not out of cruelty, but out of the accumulated weight of 100 small defeats, and that the worst thing you could do was try to climb over. So she didn't. She cooked. She cleaned. She fixed the hinge on the mudroom door that had been catching wrong for what looked like years. She learned that Douglas Brandt drank his coffee black and his tea with 1 sugar, and that he had a habit of leaving books face down, open to whatever page he'd been reading, in every room of the house, not carelessly, but deliberately, like he was always intending to come back and never quite did. She started using bookmarks instead. Small, quiet ones she made from strips of brown paper. She didn't say anything about it. She just left them in the books. He didn't say anything about them either. She had been there 3 weeks before they had a proper conversation. It was late October, and the first real cold had come overnight, sudden and mean the way Saskatchewan cold liked to arrive. She had come down at 5 in the morning to start the stove, and found him already sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and a look on his face like he'd been awake for most of the night. She filled the kettle and put it on. She didn't ask him anything. After a while he said, without looking up, "Storm took out the south fence line. All of it," she said, "most." A pause. "Percy's knee won't hold up in this cold. I'll have to do most of it myself." "You'll need to eat first," she said. She made eggs. She put the plate in front of him and poured him a fresh coffee and went about her morning business without making it a moment. She wasn't performing helpfulness. She was just being there. He ate the eggs. When he got up to leave, he paused at the doorway and said, "Thank you, Miss Voss, Laurel," she said. She wasn't looking at him either. She was washing the pan. Another pause, longer. "Douglas," he said. And then he was gone out into the cold. Percy, who had appeared from nowhere, in the way Percy always appeared from nowhere, raised his eyebrows at her from the hallway. She said, "Don't." He grinned and disappeared again. The thing about Douglas Brandt, she learned slowly, was that he had not always been this way. She didn't learn it from him. She learned it the way you learn most things about quiet people. In pieces, from the sides, from the way other people spoke around the subject. Percy told her about the ranch in its better years, when Douglas's parents were still alive, and the operation was twice the size it was now. He mentioned carefully that Douglas had married young, a woman from Regina named Margaret, who had been sharp and pretty and fundamentally unsuited to the isolation, and that the marriage had lasted 8 years and ended badly. She needed more than he knew how to give, Percy said, and he needed more than she wanted to stay for. The woman at the hardware store in town, a wide-faced woman named Glenda, who seemed to know everything about everyone within 40 kilometers, told her that Douglas had been different before. "Used to come in, talk your ear off," she said, handing Laurel her change. "Laugh." He had a good laugh. She looked at Laurel with a directness that wasn't unfriendly. "You're the one from the agency. Yes, you're still there." "I am." Glenda nodded like this, meant something, and didn't elaborate. The local minister, who came for dinner one Sunday in November because Percy had invited him, and Douglas couldn't figure out how to uninvite him without being rude, was a small energetic man named Reverend Okafor, who had grown up in Edmonton and had strong opinions about hockey and prairie winters. He made Douglas smile twice over the meal, real smiles, small and reluctant and gone quickly, but real. Laurel watched this from her end of the table and thought, there it is. She wasn't trying to find something, that was the difference. She wasn't looking for the man underneath the silence, wasn't running some project to warm him up or bring him back. She had her own life. She read in the evenings. She called her sister in Moncton every second Sunday. She took long walks along the fence lines when the weather allowed and learned the particular vocabulary of that land. The way the light went in November, low and thin and golden. The sound the dry grass made, the geometry of the shelter belts. She was simply present, fully, quietly present. And she had learned, over a long enough life, that this was rarer than people understood. Christmas came. She had assumed he would not want anything made of it, so she made very little. A wreath on the door. A small decoration on the kitchen table, just a few pine branches she'd gathered, and a candle. She baked shortbread because Percy had mentioned offhandedly, twice, that Douglas's mother used to make shortbread at Christmas, and then felt immediately guilty about mentioning it. She didn't say why she was baking it, she just left it in a tin on the counter. Christmas Eve she came downstairs and found Douglas standing at the kitchen window in the dark, not moving. She stopped in the doorway. He didn't hear her at first. She watched him. This man who had made himself into a closed room. And she thought about her father, and about the professor in Fredericton, and about all the things people left unsaid for so long, that eventually the words just calcified inside them. And you could see it in the set of their shoulders. She went to the stove and turned on the element under the kettle. He turned then. "I didn't hear you come down," he said. "Sorry." "No." He looked at her. "Don't be." She made 2 cups. She brought both to the table and sat down, and he sat down across from her, and they sat in the dark kitchen in the candlelight, with the snow coming down outside, and they didn't say very much. He told her once, haltingly, like someone testing ice, that the ranch had been in his family for 4 generations, that his grandfather had broken this land, that he'd always expected to have children here, someday, and then time had moved the way time does, and someday had become a word he'd stopped using. She said, "I know how that goes." He looked at her. "Not children," she said, "just someday. I know how that word stops meaning anything." A long silence. "You're not from out here," he said. Not a question. "New Brunswick. Originally, I've moved around." "Why?" She considered this. "I think I was looking for something I couldn't have named. And then I stopped looking and started just going where the work was. It's quieter that way." He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he used to speak. They stayed there until the candle burned halfway down, and then she said good night and went back upstairs, and she lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought, "Don't." She knew what was happening, and she knew what it meant, and she knew that nothing about it was simple. She was an employee. He was a man who had learned to keep people at arm's length as a matter of survival. Whatever she was feeling, that soft, cautious, warming thing, she had no business encouraging it. She was not going to be the woman who was undone by a silent man in a winter kitchen. She closed her eyes. She went to sleep. In the morning, there was a small gift on the kitchen table, wrapped in brown paper, her own brown paper, the kind she made bookmarks from. Wrapped carefully, though, with the edges folded down. Inside was a book of poetry, the collected works of E.J. Pratt, old, well-read. His copy, she thought, from the soft wear of the spine. On the inside cover, in careful handwriting, "Merry Christmas." She stood there in the early morning cold with the book in her hands and felt something rearrange itself in her chest, quietly, without fanfare. She put it on her shelf. She didn't say anything about it at breakfast. She just made his coffee and put it in front of him and said, "Merry Christmas, Douglas." He said, "Merry Christmas, Laurel," and that was the whole of it. January was hard. A cold snap came, and that had even Percy speaking in low, worried voices about the cattle. Douglas was out before dawn every morning, and back after dark, and in between he was the kind of tired that didn't leave you even when you slept. She left food for him in the warming drawer. She fixed the burst pipe in the utility room with Percy's help, and a YouTube tutorial she watched 3 times. She didn't mention any of it. One night in mid-January, he came in so cold she could see his hands shaking, and she didn't think about it. She just took both his hands in hers and rubbed them. Practical, purposeful. She'd done the same thing for her brother when they were children, coming in from skating. He went very still. She let go and stepped back. "Sorry," she said. "No," he said. "Very quiet, don't be." It was the second time he'd said that, and she catalogued it without meaning to. He sat down at the table and she put a bowl of soup in front of him, and she turned away to give him privacy to collect himself, because she understood, she had always understood, that some men needed the moment of recovery, and she heard him exhale, long, slow, like something leaving. She didn't look. "Laurel," he said. She turned. He was looking at the soup. A long pause. "I know I'm not easy to work for." "You're fine," she said. "I'm not, I know that." He looked up then. "The other women from the agency, I wasn't rude to them, I don't think. I just—" He stopped. Tried again. "I don't know how to be around people anymore. I'm not sure I remember the trick of it." She sat down. "What happened to the trick?" she said, gently. He looked at her for a moment like nobody had ever asked him that directly. Maybe nobody had. "I think," he said slowly, "I gave it away. And then I spent a long time being angry that I'd given it away, and then I was just tired of being angry. And after that I didn't see the point of learning it again." She said, "And now?" He looked at the soup again. "Now I have a woman who fixes my pipes and makes me bookmarks, and doesn't ask me anything I can't answer." There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not quite humor. More like the place humor comes from. A kind of soft acknowledgement that life was in fact still happening to him. "I ask you things," she said. "Things I can't answer," he said. "You know the difference." She did know the difference. She'd always known the difference. She sat with that for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. It was simply true, and it seemed like he needed to hear it. He didn't say anything, but he ate the soup. February thawed early, the way it sometimes did. Cruel, temporary, one warm week before the cold came back. And she found him in the south field, one afternoon repairing the fence line that the October storm had damaged. She'd brought out coffee in a thermos, which she told herself was practical. He was working with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 times more. She stood and watched him for a moment before he heard her. "Coffee," she said when he turned. "You didn't have to come all the way out here. I know." He took the thermos. Their fingers touched briefly, the way fingers touch when things are exchanged between people who are paying too much attention to not paying attention. And she looked out at the flat horizon and said nothing. "My grandfather planted those trees," he said, nodding toward the shelter belt to the north. "Took him 10 years to get them to take—" "They took," she said. "They did." A pause. The cold wind came. "I used to think this place was enough," he said. "The land, the work. I thought if I just kept doing it, kept the thing going, that would be—" He stopped. "I don't know what I thought it would be." "Sufficient," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, is it?" A long silence. A bird somewhere in the shelter belt. The fence wire singing faintly in the wind. "Less than it used to be," he said. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with him in the cold, drinking coffee, looking at his grandfather's trees. She thought, this is the moment. Not a dramatic moment. Not a moment anyone would make a film of. Just a man standing in a field, admitting quietly that the walls he'd built weren't keeping out as much cold as they used to. Just a woman standing next to him, not making him say more than he'd said. She thought, be careful. She was careful all the way home. The conversation she'd been afraid of happened in March, without warning, the way the conversations you're afraid of always do. She had been in town. She had run into Glenda at the hardware store, which was inevitable. And Glenda had said with her characteristic bluntness, there's a rumor in town that Doug Brandt has finally joined the living again. People are crediting his housekeeper. Laurel had said evenly, people should find better things to talk about. Glenda had smiled. Probably. Doesn't mean they're wrong. She drove home in a mood she couldn't entirely name, discomfort. Not because of what Glenda had said, but because of the way it had landed. The small internal flinch that meant something was true. She walked in and Douglas was in the kitchen. This was unusual. He was normally still outside at this hour. He was standing at the counter, not doing anything, and he turned when she came in and said, I need to say something to you. Her coat was still on. She put her bag down. All right, she said. He looked like a man choosing words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. I don't want you to go, he said. She waited. I know that's not. He stopped. I know you have a contract. I know this is employment. I'm not saying this as your employer. A pause. I'm not entirely sure what I'm saying it as, she said. Say what you mean, Douglas. He looked at her then, full on. The way he'd looked at her in the kitchen at Christmas, and in the field in February, and a dozen other times she'd told herself she was imagining. I mean, he said, that this winter has been the first winter in a long time that I've not been dreading the next day. And I know that's not. I know you have a life that has nothing to do with this place. And I'm not asking you to. He stopped again, exhaled. I'm not very good at this. You're doing fine, she said. I'm saying I don't want you to leave. I'm saying, he looked at the floor, back up. I'm saying that I know what you are to me is not what a housekeeper is supposed to be, and I don't know what to do about it, except tell you directly, because I have spent too many years not telling people things directly, and I think it has cost me. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the note the professor had left her. You were the best company I ever had, and I never told you. She thought about what it cost people to say things too late. She thought about her father and her mother, and all the quiet houses full of people who hadn't said the things they meant. I'm not leaving, she said. He looked at her. I mean, she said, I was not planning to leave. For the record, I like it here. She paused. She stopped. Started again. I'm not leaving, Douglas. Something moved across his face. She had never seen it before on him, that particular unguarded thing, like a window opening. He crossed the kitchen in a few steps, and then he stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up, and he said very quietly, all right. And then, carefully, the way he did everything carefully, as though things that mattered were fragile and should be handled accordingly. He put one hand against her face and kissed her. It was not a complicated kiss. It was brief and warm and honest, like most of the things he eventually managed to say. And when he stepped back, he looked at her like he wasn't sure it had actually happened. Okay, she said. She felt something loose and warm in her chest, something she hadn't expected to feel again for a while. Okay. He almost smiled. Not quite. The place right before a smile. Percy's going to be insufferable, she said. He did smile then. Fully, unexpectedly, the way Glenda had described, and it changed the whole geometry of his face, made him look younger and less like a man who had forgotten the trick of being a person. Percy, he said, has been insufferable since November. He has been waiting for this. He knew. Percy, Douglas said, has not been subtle. She laughed. And he laughed too, quiet and real, and outside the window his grandfather's trees stood in the cold March light, and the sky was that particular Saskatchewan blue that made you feel like the world was a bigger place than you'd remembered. They were married in September, at the small church outside town, with Percy standing up for Douglas in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders, and Reverend Okafor officiating with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting for this nearly as long as Percy had. She wore her grandmother's earrings and a dress she'd found in a shop in Regina, pale blue, simple. Her sister flew in from Moncton and cried, which she had predicted. Douglas wore his good jacket and looked at her when she came down the aisle with an expression that said, plainly and without qualification, there she is. No performance in it, no grandeur, just recognition. After the ceremony, standing outside in the September light, before anyone could stop them to take photographs or give toasts, he put both arms around her and held her the way he'd been learning to hold things, carefully, fully, like he had no intention of letting go. She pressed her face into his shoulder. "Told you," Percy said loudly, to no one in particular. "Percy," Douglas said without moving. "Yep," Percy said, satisfied. "You're welcome." In October, the fall came properly. The good fall, all gold and rust and the particular quality of light that made the shelter belt look like something from a painting. She found Douglas's grandfather's journal in a box in the study while she was reorganizing. A small, dense notebook full of careful handwriting that documented the first years of the ranch, the fencing, the trees, the slow, incremental business of making something out of hard ground. She brought it to Douglas at the kitchen table. He opened it, read a few lines, closed it and sat with it in his hands for a moment. He never thought it would work, Douglas said. He wrote that once. He said he'd planted those trees, and he didn't believe they'd take, and every morning he went out to check, and every morning he expected them to be dead. But he kept checking, she said. He kept checking. He looked at her. He said the first spring they leafed out. He stood there and didn't know what to do with himself. He'd spent so long expecting loss that he didn't know what to do when the thing held. Laurel looked at him and thought, yes. She thought about the dry earth smell of this place when she'd first arrived. She thought about the lamp with the wick turned down. She thought about the 10 years it had taken his grandfather to grow those trees, and the patience required, and the particular courage of people who keep tending things when they can't see yet whether the things will hold. "We should plant something," she said. He looked at her. "What? In the spring. We should add to the shelter belt, on the south side." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the October light was doing the thing it did, gold and low and tender. "All right," he said. And she knew, from the way he said it, that he wasn't just talking about trees. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up and held on, and the journal sat between them with all its careful record of the slow, patient work of making something grow in difficult ground. That was all. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.